The air inside the tent felt thick with heat, dust hanging under the lights. Dozens of special operators, soldiers, and support staff packed tightly, their boots shifting on the wooden floor as the mission brief began. Projected maps shimmered, radios crackled softly, and hushed voices filled the space with the familiar pre-mission jitters. Sergeant Mara Katon slipped in unnoticed, her tablet held tightly. At 28, she seemed more suited for an office desk than a war zone. The instant she appeared, two special operators murmured she was only about maps and data. A naval officer grinned, muttering she was the last one you'd hand a rifle to. Master Chief Donovan Rake openly showed his annoyance. He gestured to the tent's rear, telling her to stand there so the team had a clear view. A few quiet laughs spread among the men. Mara didn't flinch. She simply tightened her hold on the tablet, moved to the side, her face calm, giving nothing away. Still, the unease lingered. Quick glances kept finding her, silent judgment passing between faces as the meeting continued. Mara Katon was never the loudest voice in any room. Even as a child, she preferred the edge of the crowd, watching how people behaved, how problems began, how they might have been avoided. While others sought attention, she hunted for the small details everyone else missed. By 28, that habit had become her profession. The Army called her a terrain and threat analyst. Her job on paper was simple: study maps, satellite images, and patrol reports to find hidden dangers before anyone stepped into them. In reality, it meant long hours, tired eyes, and the chilling knowledge that if she missed something, someone else might pay the price. When she arrived in eastern Afghanistan and joined Naval Special Warfare Task Group ECHO, nothing about her appeared remarkable. She was average height, a small frame under a standard uniform, sleeves rolled just enough for comfort. Her voice was calm and steady, never raised, and she didn't force herself into conversations. For many of the operators on base, first impressions were all that counted. They saw a quiet Army sergeant with a tablet and thought they had her figured out. Another intel type, another person who understood the idea of war, but not its true burden. They didn't know how early she woke every morning. Before the sun was fully up, before rotors spun and engines started, Mara would be outside in a quiet corner of the compound. She stood still, eyes closed, practicing slow breathing exercises, breath in for 4 counts, hold, breath out for 4 counts, again and again until her heart found a steady rhythm. This breathing wasn't just for stress, it was training. She focused on how her chest rose, how her shoulders stayed low, how her hands remained steady. She never spoke about why she did it. She just did it every day, even when no one was watching. When she went back inside, the base's noise surrounded her. Laughter from the gym, arguments over radio frequencies, operators swapping tales in the mess hall. Voices loud and self-assured. Special operators and soldiers liked to joke sharply, their humor built on risk and memory. They were used to being the center of every story. Support staff moved around them like quieter currents. Mechanics, medics, intelligence, communications, necessary but often pushed into the background. The unspoken rule on base was simple: those who fight are up front, everyone else behind. It showed in how seats filled during meetings, who got interrupted, and whose opinions were treated like background noise. Mara felt that boundary every day. In meetings, operators talked over her without a second thought. Walking to the command post, someone would squeeze past her as if she were in the way, not part of the team. Comments weren't always cruel, but they carried the same message: you don't belong here. She carried one thing that didn't fit that picture: a small, worn ballistic journal. It fit in her right hand as if it had been there for years. The cover was cracked, the edges dark from sweat and dust, the pages inside filled with handwritten notes and numbers. She never left it behind. People noticed the journal, but only in passing. A communication specialist once saw her flipping through it while waiting for a file to download. Small lines for elevation, wind speed, and distance were neatly scribbled. He thought about asking what it was, then let it go. On this base, everyone had their quirks. When Mara sat at her desk in the intel cell, her work was quiet but intense. She traced ridgelines on plastic overlays, then closed her eyes and sketched them again from memory in a notebook. She could recall which valley turned left at a certain rock formation, and which one opened into a wider basin. Terrain stuck in her head like familiar streets in a hometown. She noticed more than just hills and distances. She caught small patterns in patrol logs where contact seemed to flare up and then vanish along certain routes. She marked unusual gaps in intercepted chatter. She saw how weather fronts shifted dust and smoke, changing what drones could or couldn't see. Most of it she kept to herself until it truly mattered. The first time someone saw the scar on her forearm, it was by chance. She pushed her sleeve up to wash her hands at a metal sink by the latrine, and the pale line along her skin caught the light. It was long, thin, and old, the kind of mark from something sharp and quick. A junior sailor glanced at it, hesitated as if he wanted to ask, then looked away. Out here, everyone had some kind of scar. No one put. Under the cuff of her left sleeve, a faint geometric tattoo showed when the fabric shifted just right. Clean angles, no bright colors, more like a mark than decoration. It wasn't a unit crest anyone recognized, not one of the usual designs people boasted about. She never explained. The more no one asked, the more it remained part of the quiet mystery surrounding her. Inside her tablet case, taped where only she saw it, sat an old army marksman badge. The cloth was worn at the edges, the stitching slightly loose from years of handling. When the tablet was closed and she was alone, she sometimes rested her thumb on that badge for a second before returning to work. It reminded her of a part of her record that didn't appear in the presentations and staff meetings. Task Group Echo's culture left little room for that kind of story. Around the fire pits and weight racks, the talk was about fast roping, hard landings, narrow escapes and close calls. The men who had faced the worst battles carried it in their voices. The ones who hadn't yet been there listened intently, eager for their turn. No one asked the intel sergeant about her past. They assumed they already knew it. Mara understood this. It wasn't new. In earlier units she had learned the same lesson. The more she tried to prove herself by talking, the less anyone listened. So over time she stopped trying. She kept her words brief, her answers direct, and her energy focused on the work in front of her. That didn't mean she lacked courage. When a detail didn't add up on a map, she stayed late until she found the missing piece. When someone sent her a patrol route that cut too close to a known pattern of ambushes, she flagged it. Even if the platoon leader rolled his eyes, she didn't argue to win respect. She spoke up to keep people alive. Her quiet nature was sometimes mistaken for fear. She was careful, not timid. When she sat at the far end of a table, it wasn't because she wanted to disappear. It was because she could see everyone better from there, see who was paying attention, and who wasn't. She logged those reactions the same way she logged terrain. Calmly, without emotion, but never forgetting. Little by little, a few people started to notice that she was almost always right about the small things. A wind shift she mentioned would hit exactly when a suggested alternate route would turn out to be the safer one. A warning she had written in the margin of a slide would match how a firefight actually unfolded. None of it was loud or dramatic. It was just there, again and again. Still, the divide remained. Operators in Task Group Echo lived in a world where respect was often measured in scars, stories, and time under fire. Mara didn't offer any of that to them. She let the judgment sit where it fell and kept her focus on the maps, the ridges and the numbers in that worn ballistic journal. In her mind, there would come a day when talking wouldn't be enough, a day when all the quiet work, all the patterns, all the breathing exercises, and careful notes would have to emerge from the shadows. Until that day arrived, she stayed where she believed she belonged, at the edge of the room, watching, preparing, waiting for the moment when her voice and her skills would finally matter. The first week with Task Group Echo passed quickly. Missions stacked up, briefings blended together, and new faces became familiar only by their last names on patches and radio calls. Mara spent most of her time in the intel cell building route plans and pattern slides, trying to stay ahead of a valley that never stopped changing. One afternoon, the planning room was packed for a detailed route analysis. Maps were spread across the table, satellite images on the screen, and the air smelled like coffee, dust, and dry sweat. Mara stood near the front with the laser point. Walking through the planned movement for an upcoming raid, she traced the main road on the imagery, then tapped a cluster of contour lines on the northern edge of the valley. She was halfway through explaining how the wind funneled between two ridges, when a special operations lieutenant interrupted her. "We understand," he said, stepping forward. "We've run this valley before. The team will move fast through the draw and hit the compound before first light." The room's focus shifted toward him as if a spotlight had moved. The interruption wasn't loud, but it was complete. Mara closed her mouth, swallowed her next sentence, and let the silence pass over her. She could have argued. Instead, she lowered her hand and waited, watching how he dismissed the ridges with a few vague hand gestures. The details she was trying to highlight hung in the air and then vanished. Later that night, she sat alone at her desk, adjusting the same road in the system. From the hallway, two operators walked by, voices low but clear enough. "Dangerous mission for her," one said. "Those presentations won't rearrange themselves." The other laughed. "Hope she doesn't get a paper cut in there." Mara paused, her fingers resting on the keyboard. The joke landed in the same spot all the others did. Not deep enough to cause real harm, but sharp enough to leave a small sting. She let out a slow breath, then went back to editing the rote, fixing small things no one else would know needed fixed. The next morning brought another full briefing. The big tent smelled like dust and generator exhaust. Rex stood at the front, arms crossed, staring at the projected image of the valley. Mara stood off to the side with her tablet and notes, ready to explain the terrain. She pointed at the eastern ridge, its shape clear in the overhead view. "Sir, this ridge looks clear from drone feeds, but the rock face and angle," Rex cut in before she finished. "Sergeant, I've been in these mountains for 20 years. I know what a ridge looks like." A few operators smirked, eyes shifting from the screen to her. Mara felt their attention like a weight on her shoulders. "I'm not saying you don't, Master Chief," she replied, keeping her tone even. "I'm saying the imagery and wind data together suggest." He tilted his head, almost amused. "Do you even get to see the valley outside that office of yours? Or is all this just lines on a screen to you?" The line drew a small ripple of laughter across the room. It wasn't a roar, just a soft murmur that moved from one group of men to another. No one shouted, but the message landed clearly. She was the one who didn't understand, not them. Mara nodded once, letting the moment pass. She could feel the heat in her face, but she kept her voice steady. "The terrain doesn't care who looks at it, Master Chief. It behaves the same for everyone." Her answer hung there for a second. Rex didn't reply. He turned back to the map, and the brief continued without her input. Later that day, a smaller group gathered in the mission planning room to fine-tune the assault plan. Mara stood at the front this time, images loaded, notes read. Several soldiers and special operators leaned against the walls, helmets hanging from their gear, arms crossed. She began explaining the approach again, focusing on elevation changes. "Here is where the slope steepens. It will slow you down and narrow your field of view. I recommend shifting this leg." A soldier sergeant stepped directly between her and the screen. He didn't seem to notice he had blocked her from half the room. He pointed at a different section and started talking to another officer about fields of fire. The men on that side of the room watched the sergeant, not her. Mara fell silent, her words cut short. The map she had prepared turned into background wallpaper. She shifted slightly to the left, trying to regain a line of sight, but the moment was already gone. Their attention had moved. She watched in silence, hands folded around her tablet as they debated over the same routes she had already analyzed and marked. When the meeting broke, people drifted out in groups. As one special operator passed her near the door, he glanced at her and shook his head with a faint smile. "She doesn't look like someone who hits targets," he said to the guy beside him. "She looks like someone who files reports about them." They both chuckled as they walked away. The sound faded into the wider noise of the compound, but it stayed loud enough in her mind. In that moment, ask yourself something. If it had been you standing there, notes ready, watching people laugh like that, what would you have done? Would you have fought back with words, or would you have held your ground and waited? Mara did what she always did. She adjusted her grip on the tablet, checked that her data was saved, and walked back to the intel cell. Inside those walls, the screens didn't mock her, they just showed what was there. Days blurred into each other as the operation, now called Iron Dusk, drew closer on the calendar. The pattern of behavior remained the same. Operators came in loud, confident, joking about how many steps their watches would log on the raid. Support staff slipped in quietly, did their work, and left. For Mara,
The valley wasn't a story or a test. It was a problem she needed to solve before it killed someone. She layered new drone footage over old imagery, watching how shadows moved across the hills. She saw how the eastern ridge, the one everyone liked because it looked clear and easy to access, threw hard lines of dark across the valley floor at certain hours. Those shadows hid cracks and openings in the rock.
When she ran thermal overlays, small spots of lingering heat showed near those shadows. Cave mouths, she thought. Air exchange points, positions where someone could wait. Unseen until a patrol walked below. She wrote notes in her ballistic journal. Not just numbers but quick phrases. Blind pocket here. Wind shift at this gap. Likely firing angle. The next full mission brief brought everyone back into the big tent. The hum of the projector, the shuffle of chairs, the clink of gear all blended into a familiar pre-mission soundtrack. Mara stood near the front again, closer to the map. This time Wright began with the usual overview. Objective. Insertion. Timeline. His voice was steady, full of the kind of authority that came from years of leading men into dangerous places and bringing as many of them back as he could. When he reached the part about Overwatch positions, he pointed to the eastern ridge on the map. Sniper element here, he said. Clear line of sight down into the valley. Good elevation. We've used this kind of setup before. Mara felt her chest tighten. She had run this section dozens of times. She had seen the patterns, the blind spots, the way the wind shifted along that face. Master Chief, she said, raising her voice just enough to be heard. Request permission to speak on the terrain. He glanced back at her. Make it quick, Sergeant. She stepped closer to the screen and pointed at the ridge. This slope is deceptive. The imagery looks clear, but the change in rock density here and here suggests cutouts or caves. Thermal readings support that. From this position, your line of sight will skip over the most likely firing points. A few operators leaned forward now, eyes narrowing, trying to see what she saw. Others sat back, arms crossed, waiting to see how this played out. If an enemy force sets up in those hidden pockets, she went on, they can fire down into the valley while you're still moving through the draw. You will not see them until they engage. A whisper slid through the back row. Someone muttered that Intel always saw ghosts in the rocks. Another called out softly, "Here we go. Another worst-case scenario." Wright gave the room a small, almost amused smile, then turned back to her. "Sergeant Katon, I appreciate the concern, but we're not learning about this valley for the first time today." His tone was light, but the underlying message was clear. He saw this as typical worry, not a real risk. Mara kept her hand steady on the pointer. "This isn't theory, Master Chief. The data shows." "Intel worries," he said, cutting her off. Still smiling. "Operators work. That's how this goes." The comment drew a round of soft chuckles. Heads shook, shoulders relaxed. The tension shifted into a kind of easy confidence at her expense. To them it sounded like an old joke, a small reminder of who did what in this room. She let the sound wash over her without flinching. Inside, something tightened like a knot being pulled at both ends. Not anger that made her want to shout, but a cold, sharp resolve that made everything in her settle. She looked around the tent. Some faces held open mockery. Others showed nothing at all, as if they were tired of hearing Intel folks raise alarm. A few looked conflicted, eyes drawn back to the map, as if they could feel the danger, but didn't want to say it aloud. In that moment, another question hangs in the air. Not just for her, but for you. If you were standing in her place, would you push harder and risk being thrown out of the room? Or would you mark the danger in your mind, wait, and find another way to protect the people walking into it? Mara lowered the pointer. "Understood, Master Chief," she said quietly. She stepped back to the edge of the crowd, but she didn't stop studying the map. Her jaw set just a little tighter, her fingers pressed against the worn cover of the journal in her hand. On the surface, she looked like she had given up the point. Inside, she was already planning what she would do if the valley proved her right. The days leading up to Operation Iron Dusk moved slowly for some, and too quickly for others. The operators trained, checked gear, and argued over small details. Mara stayed mostly in the intel cell, quiet as always, keeping track of every new drone feed and every shift in the weather. That was when the first small clues slipped out. She walked into the supply room one morning to sign out equipment for a terrain survey. The supply tech,
Specialist Harmon sat behind the counter with a stack of forms. He barely looked up as he handed her the checkout sheet. Rifle assigned to Intel. He muttered more to himself than to her. Usual. She didn't answer. She simply wrote her name, date, and her ID number, then slid the form back. Harmon glanced at the sheet, then froze. His eyes narrowed at her signature. Not just the name, the numbers next to it. The qualification code attached to her file was one he had seen maybe twice before. Both times on operators who could hit steel plates from distances most people couldn't even see. He looked up at her, really looked this time. Mara waited with her usual stillness, hands at her sides, no sign of pride or explanation. You done this before? He asked. She gave a small nod. A few times. He didn't know what to say after that. She took the rifle case, thanked him, and walked out. Harmon watched her go, the form still in his hand. Intel didn't get paired with numbers like that. Not ever. A second clue showed itself later that afternoon. A junior operator named Lee was passing through the Intel cell to drop off a drive when he saw Mara at her desk scribbling in her notebook. She wasn't doing standard map work. Her page was filled with numbers, wind vectors, and tiny notes written so fast they almost blurred. She paused only long enough to draw a curve, then added a correction factor, then wrote another series of wind adjustments in the margin. Her pen moved without hesitation, each mark quick and sure. Lee stood there for a moment watching. He didn't understand half of what she wrote. He had seen snipers do wind calls before, but never with this kind of speed or certainty. You doing math homework? He joked. Mara closed the notebook slightly. Just checking something. He smiled and left, but the question stuck with him. Most Intel folks calculated danger zones. She was calculating something else entirely. Another clue came during a map session with a sergeant from the Ranger platoon. He wanted to confirm approach angles for a backup route. Mara pulled up the imagery, leaned forward, and began tracing possible firing positions. Her finger moved quickly across the screen, shifting between ridges, marking possible arcs of fire. She didn't think about it. She just moved fast and precise. The sergeant watched her hand move like she had walked the terrain herself, not just studied it. How'd you track that so fast? He asked. She shrugged. Just a pattern. He nodded slowly, unsure if that made sense or raised more questions. He had seen experienced team snipers trace angles like that, but Intel analysts usually paused more, double-checked, or looked unsure. She didn't. The fourth clue surfaced in the hallway outside the aid station. Mara had stopped by to drop off medical notes for the upcoming mission. As she reached up to hand the folder to the medic, her sleeve lifted just enough for the patch beneath to show. Faded fabric, worn stitching barely holding together. The medic stared for half a second. It wasn't a standard unit patch. It wasn't decorative either. It was an old qualification badge from an Army long-range marksmanship course. Not something many people earned, and definitely not something you earned by rearranging presentations. He opened his mouth to ask, then closed it again. She lowered her arm, thanked him, and walked away. The medic watched her leave, mind racing with questions. The final clue was the one no one understood, but everyone noticed eventually. The ballistic journal. Mara kept it with her everywhere. Meetings, mess hall, briefings, late-night work sessions. She never opened it around others. She never talked about it, but she always held it with the kind of care someone reserved for something important, not just useful. When she placed it on the table next to her laptop, the cover stayed shut. When she moved across the compound, her hand wrapped around it like it belonged there, like it had weight beyond paper. One night Barrett Hayes saw her sitting alone near the edge of the compound, the dim lights of the base flickering off the cracked leather cover. He walked past without saying anything, but something about the way she held it made him slow down. It wasn't a notebook you grabbed from supply. It was older, personal, passed down, maybe something inherited. And that raised a quiet question in his mind. Who gave her a ballistic journal like that? Piece by piece the hints grew. No one had proof of anything. No one had a full picture, but the little signs didn't line up with the silent intel sergeant everyone thought she was. A tech wondered about her qualifications. A young operator replayed her fast calculations in his head. A sergeant kept remembering how she read terrain like someone who had lived it. A medic couldn't forget that old faded patch, and more people than she realized had noticed the journal. The base slowly began to pay attention in a different way. Not openly, not loudly, but in quiet moments, in passing glances, in half-finished questions. Someone would see her walking across the compound and think, why does she carry herself like that? Another would see her studying the valley and wonder, how does she know those angles so well? Someone else would watch her grip tighten around that old journal and feel a tug of curiosity they couldn't explain. No one had answers yet, but everyone was starting to ask the same thing. Who exactly is Sergeant Mara Katon? The nights on base were never fully dark. Floodlights washed the compound in a dull, pale glow, and generators hummed like low thunder in the distance. Most people were asleep or trying to be, but Mara rarely ended her day when everyone else did. Her mind stayed restless long after her shift ended, especially with Operation Iron Dusk getting closer. That evening, after finishing her last update, she slipped out of the intel cell and walked behind the motor pool where the noise was lowest. The air was cool, the wind brushing softly across the valley, shifting dust in small curls. This was the hour she preferred, quiet, steady, without eyes on her. She stood still for a moment, let her breathing settle, then faced the distant ridgeline. The mountains were black shapes against a darker sky. She watched how the wind moved across them, how it angled through the low passes, and rose again in sudden updrafts. To most people it looked like nothing. To her the movement held patterns she could almost reach out and She opened her journal and began sketching the valley in faint pencil lines. She mapped airflow, noted where turbulence broke apart, and marked spots where a bullet would drift more than expected. She wasn't supposed to need this information. Her role was supposed to stay behind a screen, not behind a rifle, but she couldn't help it. The valley demanded attention, and she knew something about Iron Dusk didn't sit right. She didn't realize someone was watching her until she heard boots on gravel behind her. Chief Barrett Hayes stepped out from between two parked vehicles. Even in low light his outline was easy to recognize. Broad shoulders, slow, deliberate steps, and the calm but alert stance of a man who had spent half his life moving through dangerous places. He was the task group's senior sniper, the one newer operators watched in silence, the one whose advice was treated like law. At this hour he wasn't expecting company, and he definitely wasn't expecting someone from Intel standing alone behind the motor pool studying wind like her life depended on it. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, voice low but firm. Mara didn't turn. She finished the line she was drawing before answering. "Checking something. Looks like more than that." She closed the journal and faced him fully now. He stood with his hands on his hips, eyes sharp, trying to figure her out. She could tell by his posture that he thought she was somewhere she didn't belong. "You planning on sightseeing before the mission?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "I'm looking at the wind channels," she replied calmly. Barrett raised an eyebrow. "Wind channels?" "Yes. The wind feeds through the saddle between those two ridges. At night it pushes west, but by sunrise it reverses. That means any shot taken from the eastern ridge will drift left past 400 meters, then drift right after 800, enough to cause a..." Her voice was steady, matter of fact, as if she were explaining something simple. Barrett felt a jolt of surprise, but covered it quickly. "You make wind calls now, only when they matter." He waited, expecting her to shift her weight, look away or show some sign she was nervous under scrutiny. She didn't. She stood like someone who'd been challenged before and knew how to keep her balance. Barrett stepped closer, curiosity replacing suspicion. "You got that from standing here for 2 minutes. 2 minutes, the last drone feed, and the temperature drop," she answered. "That's so, and the rock face on the ridge catches heat longer than the dirt below. That creates a thermal dead zone. Shots through that zone will dip." Barrett blinked. That wasn't intel talk. That wasn't the kind of thing someone learned from watching screens. That was the language of real shooters. He folded his arms and studied her. "What are you doing with a ballistic journal?" "It's mine," she said simply. "What's in it?" "Notes." He almost smiled at how little she gave away. "You know, most intel folks don't carry those." "I'm not most intel folk." He didn't miss the edge in her voice. Not hostile, just honest. He decided to push her further. "All right then," he said, pointing toward the ridge. "Say we took a shot from that peak to the far side of the valley. Range is about 8. What's the drift?" 2.8 inches right at this temperature," she said without hesitation. Barrett froze. She spoke too fast, too precise, too confident. That wasn't guessing, that was experience. He narrowed his eyes. What if you were shooting from the shadowed side? The wind stays more stable. He checked that in his head. The numbers were dead on. Nobody in Intel talked like that. Not unless they'd been trained. Not unless they'd spent hours behind a scope learning the sting of miscalculations. The hard way. He took a slow step closer. You do know I'm the senior sniper here, right? Yes, and you're lecturing me about drift. I'm answering your questions. The reply wasn't defensive. It wasn't proud. It was just
Barrett wasn't used to being corrected, especially not by someone who wasn't even in his chain of command, and certainly not by someone everyone else dismissed without a second thought. He decided to test her further. Fine. Shot from the south ridge, 900 meters, crosswind at 9 knots. The dirt is dry. What's the drop? He intentionally gave her bad numbers. The wind for that ridge would never be 9 knots at this hour. She frowned slightly. It wouldn't be 9 knots. He raised an eyebrow. Wouldn't it? No, she said, shaking her head. Not at night. The valley cools unevenly. Crosswind is closer to 4 knots. Maybe 5. Drop would be around 20 inches, but the wind shift near the rocks will add 1 more. 21 inches, give or take half an inch. His jaw tightened. She was right again. Perfectly right. He searched her face for something. A clue, a crack, anything, but found only calm focus. How do you know all that? He asked finally. Patterns, she said. That's not pattern work, he muttered. That's experience. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. Barrett pulled out his phone and checked her personnel file. The cleared version he was allowed to see. It listed her as an intelligence analyst with terrain specialization. Marksmanship qualifications were normal. Nothing unusual. Nothing about advanced schools. Nothing about field evaluation. Nothing about past deployments involving Overwatch. Nothing that matched what he had just heard. He looked up from the screen at her again. Your file doesn't say any of this. I know. Why not? She hesitated for the first time. She looked down at the journal in her hand. Her thumb brushed against the cracked leather. Some things don't get written down, she said quietly. He understood that line more than most. Many of his own actions never made it onto paper. Still, he needed to be sure. He tried one last test. All right. Say someone's firing from inside a cave. You can't see them. The barrel barely sticks out. What angle would you take? Depends on the rock. He waited. If it's limestone, she continued, I'd skip the shot off the wall. The surface angle would redirect it deeper inside, but only if the rock is dry. If it's wet, the round will bite in and stop. Barrett felt something cold slide through him. That wasn't just advanced knowledge. That was rare knowledge. The kind passed between people who'd been taught by someone with years behind a scope. He let out a slow breath. The kind you exhale when your assumptions begin to collapse. Sergeant, he said, voice quieter now. Who trained you? She held his gaze steady as ever. No one here, she said. He believed her, but that only deepened the mystery. For the first time since she arrived on base, someone looked at Mara Katon and didn't see an intel analyst who made slides. He saw something else, something hidden, something sharp, something dangerous in the quietest way. Barrett stepped back, studying her like he was seeing her for the first time. Respect settled into his expression. Cautious at first, but real. All right, he said softly. You're not what they think. She didn't respond. You see the valley better than any of them, he added. Maybe better than me. Her eyes lowered for a moment, not out of modesty, but out of something closer to acceptance. Like she knew it was true, but didn't want to wear it like a badge. Barrett took one last look at the ridges. That eastern ridge is a trap, isn't it? Yeah, they're walking into it. Yes, and no one listened to you. No. Barrett nodded slowly, the weight of the situation sinking in. Then he turned back to her. You should have told me earlier. You didn't ask earlier. Something like a faint smile touched his face. The first sign of warmth she'd seen from him. Fair enough. He stared at her journal one more time. Whoever taught you, they knew what they were doing. Mara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. For the first time in task group echo, someone looked at her with understanding and with respect. but the truth about who she really was that stayed in the shadows, waiting for its moment. Dawn came early on the day of Operation Iron Dust. The sky was still pale and colorless when the helicopters lifted off, their rotors beating the cold air into a steady rhythm. Dust swirled in long trails behind them as they pushed out over the valley. On the ground, the assault teams moved fast, boots crunching across loose rock, rifles low and ready. The plan ran smoothly at first, too smoothly. Barrett Hayes moved with the sniper element on the eastern ridge, exactly where Mara had warned visibility would fail. He kept scanning, adjusting his scope, but something felt wrong. The valley floor was quiet, too quiet. No movement, no silhouettes, no signs of patrols, just wind drifting through the low ground in thin waves. Down below, the special operators advanced toward the compound, spacing out as they crossed the narrow draw. Master Chief Rake walked with them, head on a swivel, jaw tight. He had run enough missions to know when a place felt off, but momentum drove them forward. They were committed now. Then the ground seemed to shift. A whisper of movement flickered in the rock face. A sliver of metal glinted, and the ambush opened. Gunfire exploded from the ridgeline, sharp, violent bursts cutting through the morning. The sound echoed down the valley, bouncing hard off the stone. The first machine gunner opened up from a cave mouth. None of the officers had spotted on drone feeds. A second joined in seconds later. Bullets snapped past the assault team, kicking up dirt and striking rock inches from their heads. Chaos tore through the formation. Contact. Right side. Someone yelled. Multiple shooters. Multiple. Move. Move. Rake ducked behind a boulder, cursing under his breath as he tried to locate the firing points. But from the valley floor, everything looked like broken rock and shadows. The enemy was dug in deep, exactly how Mara had warned. On the eastern ridge, Barrett tried to get eyes on the shooters, but the overhang blocked his angle. He radioed Rake. "We can't see the caves, terrain is masking everything." Rake growled in reply. "How is that possible? What the hell is?" And then it happened. A single rifle shot cracked through the valley. Sharp, clean, distant. One of the machine gunners jerked backward and collapsed inside the cave, his weapon falling silent. Before anyone could process it, a second shot echoed, this one even faster. Another gunner dropped. A third shot rang out, almost overlapping the second. Another enemy fell. 3 machine gunners eliminated in less than 10 seconds. The entire valley froze. Even the gunfire from the remaining fighters hesitated for a split second, as if everyone, even the enemy, was stunned by how precise those shots were. Rake grabbed his radio. "Who fired that? Who the hell has eyes on those caves?" Only static answered for a moment. Operators scanned the ridges, trying to figure out where the shots came from. The eastern ridge. No, Barrett wasn't shooting. The angle was wrong. Then the radio crackled again. A calm, steady voice spoke through the noise. "This is Katon, Northern Ridge. 3 threats down." Rake stared at his radio, disbelief tightening every line of his face. He looked up slowly toward the northern ridge. The ridge no one was supposed to be on. The ridge only one person had warned them about. The ridge no one had assigned. And there, small but unmistakable against the early light, a lone figure knelt behind a rifle, steady as stone. Mara Katon, the intel sergeant they told to stand in the back. The woman they joked about. The one they underestimated without hesitation. Rake's mouth opened, then closed again. Words wouldn't come. Around him, every operator stopped moving for half a heartbeat, stunned by the truth settling over them. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It wasn't a fluke. It was her. For a moment, no one moved. The assault team stayed low behind rocks and shallow dips in the ground, staring at the northern ridge, as if they were seeing it for the first time. Mara lay there, small against the vast backdrop of jagged stone, steady behind her rifle. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't rushing. She was calm, almost unnervingly so. The truth settled into the valley like dust after an explosion. She wasn't just intel. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't lucky. She was the only person who had climbed high enough to see the hidden caves. The only one who understood the wind. The only one who could hit a target no one else could even see. Before Rake could form another question, another burst of fire came from a deeper cave. The rounds tore into the dirt, near the special operators,
forcing them tight against the ground. Then another crisp shot from the northern ridge. One more enemy gunner fell silent. Barrett Hayes adjusted his scope desperately on the eastern ridge, trying to confirm what he already suspected. He watched her shoot. Her timing was perfect. She waited between wind shifts, waited for the heat shimmer to settle, waited for the exact second the target exposed even a fraction of movement. Every shot lined up with the prediction she had made the night before. Behind the motor pool, everything she told him about the valley, the ricochets, the dead zones, the drifts. It was all happening exactly as she said. He whispered under his breath. She called every angle. Down below, Rake clung to the radio. He was still catching up to reality. He had ignored her warning. He had dismissed her in front of everyone. And now he was lying in a kill zone she had tried to save them from. His pride cracked in a way he hadn't felt in years. More gunfire erupted from the far end of the ridge. Another hidden shooter. Mara fired again. A short delay, then a distant thud. Another hostile down. The radios went quiet, almost unnaturally quiet between bursts of enemy fire. No chatter, no jokes, no noise, just the sound of men trying to understand the person who was currently keeping them alive. Someone whispered her name over the net. Katon. Not mocking, not joking, just awe. Another operator, breathing hard, murmured, "She's saving us." Even Barrett's voice came through quieter than usual. Northern Ridge shooter is friendly. Repeat, friendly. And she's hitting everything out there. The remaining enemy fighters panicked. Several tried to shift positions, scrambling deeper into the caves where they thought they'd be safe. One stuck his weapon out, firing blindly into the valley. Mara didn't rush. She waited, tracking the angle. When the barrel dipped too far, she took the shot. It was exact, controlled, devastating. Target neutralized, she reported softly. It didn't sound proud. It didn't sound shaken. It sounded like someone who had done this before many times, and knew exactly what mattered and what did. Rake lowered his head for a moment, gripping the rock beside him. He had always trusted experience, trusted rank, trusted the idea that the person who spoke loudest or longest had the clearest understanding. But now he was staring at the ridge where a woman he barely respected was dismantling an ambush that should have killed them all. He felt the weight of every time he'd cut her off, every joke he didn't stop, every warning he ignored. Another burst of gunfire sprayed the valley. The team ducked. Barrett couldn't hit from his angle. The eastern ridge was useless now. Exactly like she'd warned. Mara spoke calmly into the net. "I have visual on last firing point." She fired. A long pause followed. Then Barrett saw the movement stop. The last shooter dropping his weapon, falling back into the cave. Silence moved through the valley like a slow wave. One by one, the echoes faded. The dust settled. The only sound left was the soft wind moving through the rocks. No one spoke. No one dared. Finally, Rake lifted his radio. His voice, for the first time in her presence, held no pride, no rank, no doubt, only respect. "Katon," he said quietly. Static crackled. "Keep firing." It was the moment everything changed. The moment every operator in task group, Echo, understood exactly who she was. The moment the quiet woman they mocked became the one person they trusted with their lives. The operation ended with the sun high over the valley, and dust still settling on the ridge. The assault team moved back toward the base in silence, each man carrying the weight of what almost happened, and the weight of who had stopped it. When they reached the compound, word had already spread. Support staff paused in their work as the operators walked in, shaken, but alert. Inside the main briefing tent, the entire task group gathered. Chairs scraped the floor as people filled every row. Barrett Hayes stood near the front, arms crossed, eyes on the entrance. Mara walked in quietly, holding her tablet and her worn ballistic journal, with the same calm she always carried. She tried to sit in the back, but Rake motioned her forward. "Front," he said, not as an order, but as an acknowledgement. She stepped up beside him, uncertain, but steady. Rake faced the room, his jaw tight, his expression serious in a way that felt heavier than usual. He took a slow breath before speaking. "I owe you all the truth," he began. His voice was strong, but there was something softer in it. "This morning we walked into a kill zone, not by chance, by mistake. Mine." The room shifted. Eyes widened. A few men lowered their heads. Rake continued. Sergeant Katon warned us. She told me the Eastern Ridge was wrong. I didn't listen. He glanced at her, then back at the team. Because I assumed I knew better. Because I assumed her role meant her insight wasn't worth as much as mine. No one spoke. No one even shifted in their seat. He cleared his throat and said, 12 of you were in the line of fire when the ambush hit. 12. He paused, letting the number set. Every one of you is standing here right now because she was on that northern ridge. A long silence followed, the kind that said everything without a word. Barrett stepped forward, reaching into his pocket. He held out a Special Operations Challenge coin, one with years of dust and memory on it. He didn't speak. He simply pressed it into Mara's hand. A gesture like that needed no explanation. When she walked past the second row, an operator who had laughed at her days earlier met her eyes and gave a small sober nod. No smile, no joke, just quiet respect. Another man touched his fingers to his helmet, in a brief, wordless salute. Mara didn't stand taller. She didn't change her expression. She stayed exactly who she was. Steady, calm, grounded. When Rake thanked her directly, she only said, "I did my job, Master Chief." Nothing more, nothing less. The narrator's reflection settles gently over the moment. Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits in the quiet, steady hands of someone no one notices, until the world needs them, and the moral of the story rises as naturally as breath. Never underestimate the quiet one. Their silence might be the shield that saves you. Some stories don't rise with noise or glory. They rise from the quiet places, from the people who stand in the back of the room, who say little, who watch more than they speak. Mara Katon never asked for attention, and she never chased it. Yet, when the moment came, when 12 lives hung on a thin edge, it was her steady hands and silent discipline that held the line. Strength doesn't always look the way people expect. Sometimes it's a calm voice on the radio. Sometimes it's a single shot that breaks the darkness. Sometimes it's a soldier no one noticed, until the moment she became impossible to ignore.